Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. AOC and her fellow travelers on the left are appearing to enjoy the fact that the economy built during the presidency of Donald Trump is tanking. Because, of course, that gives them a better chance to unseat him in November. But the problem really is their own candidate. If anything, Joe Biden's cognitive issues seem to have worsened. This week, he was interviewed for 17 minutes and never looked at the camera on his home computer. But what will haunt Biden for the duration was his recent inability to even repeat the most basic element of the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by go. You know the thing.
Yes, we know the thing. Problem is, we're not sure if you do. And rest assured that the Trump campaign is ready to absolutely eviscerate the former vice president for his endless string of gaffes. And this one from recent days is likely to be prominent.
You know, there's during World War II, where Roosevelt came up with a thing that was totally different than he called it the World War II. He had the War Production Board.
Yes, folks, that guy wants to be your next president. We'll talk more about the state of the Biden campaign with LibertyNation.com chief political correspondent Graham Noble in a bit.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So Joe Biden continues to embarrass himself even as he's forced to stay in his house in Delaware trying to run a presidential campaign. As we played you in our Say What segment, this week's red-faced episode for the cognitively challenged presumptive Democratic presidential nominee was to not realize for the full 17 minutes of an online interview that he wasn't looking at the host. He was not looking at the camera. Of course, this is just another in a long line of head-shaking episodes that has to make you wonder how this guy's going to make it through another 6 months, especially when President Trump starts getting up in his face and releasing a raging river of gaffes committed by the former vice president. Here to help us figure out how, or perhaps whether, Joe Biden can first make it to November intact, what woman he is likely to pick for his running mate, and how he can actually beat Trump, is our chief political correspondent at LibertyNation.com, the outspoken Graham Noble. Hello, Graham.
Hey, Tim. How you doing?
Good. Welcome back to the show. Do you think all these gaffes and missteps and misstatements by Joe Biden are actually as big a deal to voters as it might appear?
Well, Tim, I mean, it certainly should be a big deal. And obviously to Trump supporters, Republicans, conservatives in general, and I believe probably to a large percentage of the independents out there, this is a very big deal. It is amazing to me that the vast majority of Democrats seem to be just completely ignoring the whole situation, which I think is, I'm sure they must be worried about it, but they're certainly not publicly admitting any concern.
So Trump will use the stumbling and bumbling against Biden, his inability to take command of a crisis like the one we're in now, but also he's going to bring up the lining of his son's pockets based on his foreign relationships with Ukraine, China, and other countries, that he's captive to a radical agenda from the Democratic Party, his status as the ultimate Washington insider, a male version of Hillary Clinton. Which of these arguments do you think, Graham, will be most effective for Trump?
Well, knowing Trump, he's going to use every single one of those arguments within the space of a few words or a couple of sentences every time he speaks about his prospective opponent. I think really, considering what we're going through at the moment, I believe that it's got to the point where China is, in fact, a huge liability for Biden. In fact, I believe there was a new Pew Research Center poll that just came out that says that China's unfavorability rating, for want of a better term, in the US is currently something like 66% or something. 66% of Americans who responded to that survey said they have an unfavorable view of China. And I believe that in the same survey, something like it was either 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 Americans view China as a threat. And I think Biden's undeniable connections, shall we say, to that country is going to prove a liability to him.
Well, of course, Joe Biden has for years been a defender of our relationship with China. And when President Trump shut down the border or shut down flights, shut down travel from and to China, Joe Biden said that it was totally unwarranted and that Trump is a xenophobe, to which Trump responded, I don't think Joe Biden even knows what that word means. But you're right. He's going to have an awful lot of splaining to do about his longtime defense of China. But what in turn do you think Biden's best issues will be for attacking Trump?
I think what he's going to do is he's going to try to hit Trump on our disintegrating economy, and he's going to try to play some verbal jujitsu there in terms of making it seem as though the economy and the mess that it's in is actually all down to Trump's not handling the coronavirus issue correctly.
It seems like Trump can't win for losing, because he can claim that he held down the deaths, but at the expense of an economy that is tanking, and that he shouldn't have ordered the whole country shut down, even though we had few deaths. But if we have a lot of deaths, they'll say he didn't do enough. So, I mean, in other words, there's really nothing he can do that he isn't going to be attacked on. So it's all just a matter of what angle the Democrats are going to come from. Now, given that Joe Biden clearly appears to be on, shall we say, the other side of the hill, he'd be the oldest president to take the oath of office at 78 years old. He'd be 82 at the end of his first term when he'd run for 4 more years. Biden's running mate, his selection for vice president, is likely going to be far more important than usual. He's committed to picking a woman. Who would be the best choice?
I think that there are no good options for him, quite frankly. Everyone you can think of has got some issues. Let's say it's hard to, from a Democrat's point of view, I think it's hard to argue that Elizabeth Warren is not probably his best choice, although, of course, she is not a woman of color, unless, of course, you count the 1024th part Native American that she is. But everybody is going on about, checking the identity politics boxes. He's got to pick a running mate who is a woman of color. But, you can't help thinking that from a point of view of name recognition, somewhat of a loyal following, even though they didn't come through for her in the primaries, and also fundraising power, it's hard to argue that Elizabeth Warren is not perhaps his best choice.
Then there's Stacey Abrams, a woman that came within, maybe not a heartbeat, but very close to winning the governor's seat in Georgia, and she became a rising star in the Democratic Party, but she didn't win the governorship. So she's never held elective office beyond the Georgia state level. But there's a lot of enthusiasm for her on the whole identity politics thing. She checks all the boxes that you could possibly check. She's very well spoken. She's passionate. She's also very left wing. What would you say about her as a running mate? Would she be good? Would she help Biden? Would she hurt him? Would she make no difference?
It's hard to say. I mean, Biden's problem here almost is that whether any Democrats want to admit it or not, he really does have to choose a running mate who is capable of taking over as president. I mean, because for a start, even in the event that Biden were to win in November and become president, I don't see a path for him to serve a second term. I really don't. I think if he did win, he's absolutely going to be a one-term president if he even makes it through his first term. So on the one hand, he's got to pick a running mate who is seen by people as competent to jump into the role of the chief executive and commander in chief at a moment's notice almost. But also he needs to pick a running mate who's not going to actually upstage him during the campaign.
How's he going to achieve that?
Well, that's exactly, Tim. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I'm glad you don't, because I certainly don't.
No. If I knew the answer to that question, then I guess I'd be running Biden's campaign.
Graham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tim.
Graham Noble, chief political correspondent for LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So Joe Biden stepped in it recently, not that that's anything new, but this time he might have inflamed his most important voters, his base, the people he needs to show up in big numbers supporting him on November 3rd. He said, as we played in the first segment, that if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, you ain't black. Almost as if he himself was black, which he most decidedly is not. Joining us to analyze whether this big dust-up was truly damaging to the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, or merely a tempest in a teapot sure to be ignored by the elite media, is the man who schools us on the cross-section of culture and politics, LibertyNation.com socio-political correspondent, Mr. Jeff Charles. Welcome back, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
It's a pleasure. Now, Jeff, if you're not voting for me over Trump, you ain't black. Half of me says Joe Biden made a huge mistake acting like he takes the black vote for granted. But the other half of me says he was just being what he said, a wise guy making a flippant remark. Which are you buying and why?
I'm buying both of those. See, but here's one thing where I'll push back on you a little bit. He said acting like he takes the black vote for granted. No, he's not acting. He does take the black vote for granted, which is what the Democrats have done for decades. And realistically, I mean, it's hard to blame them when they've had 90% of the black vote for decades.
Jeff, explain to me why Joe Biden seems to be so popular among black people. Is it just because he was Obama's vice president?
I think that's part of it, but I don't think that explains all of it. I think Biden presents a sense of familiarity, a sense of normalcy. On top of that, I mean, about 65% of black voters consider themselves to be moderate or conservative. So there's a very small percentage that are actually way to the far left. So when it comes to the field of Democratic nominees during the primaries, he's the one that they were going to gravitate to in the first place.
Now, Jeff, on one side, you have Biden's long support from the NAACP and his voting record on civil rights. On the other, you have his support for the infamous crime bill in the 1990s, which incarcerated an awful lot of black people.
He was one of the authors and champions of that bill, which had a devastating impact on the black community. It helped the war on drugs, which disproportionately affected black Americans, despite the fact that black Americans don't commit drug crimes more than anybody else. So he has a lot to answer for there, but he's not going to be held to account for it. The left wants to beat Trump. So if pictures show up of Joe Biden wearing blackface and a Klan hood, they're still going to support him.
Okay. I think you've made your point in as stark a term as possible. Now, I want to go back to something that you said, which we've discussed before, which is that in describing themselves, a majority of black people call themselves conservative, and yet they vote in numbers usually over 90% for the Democratic presidential candidate.
Over the past 60 years, the Republican Party has not made a concerted effort to reach black voters. Now, Trump is starting to do that. But here's the thing. Throughout the history, since the Republican Party was formed, there has been a bit of a back and forth. And when when black people started voting more Democrat, when Eisenhower took over, he was convinced to do at least some outreach to the black community. And when he did that, and when his campaign team did that, they almost doubled the amount of black support that they had received previously when Eisenhower was first elected.
Now, as you've said, President Trump has made really an unprecedented effort for a Republican to reach black voters, or the biggest effort since the 1950s. How much of a difference do you see this making in the black vote, which Trump got 8% of in 2016?
Yeah, those are all factors that will work in his favor. I think the COVID-19 situation might put a little hurt on that. But I think overall, just the fact that he's even trying, I think that's going to get him more than what he had before. I'm not sure how much of an increase that'll be, but I think he has a good chance of getting over 10%. And a lot of that, too, is because Joe's voter enthusiasm is in the toilet. Like, people who support him aren't very excited about it, whereas with Trump, people are more excited.
Well, I wrote a piece last week on LibertyNation.com about that enthusiasm gap, 18-point difference between Democrats excited about this election and Republicans, and that's 18 points in Trump's favor. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.